something different tonight. We're going to be looking at material that will be quite damaging to Islam, and that's the whole intention. I make no apologies for that. I've spent 30 years confronting Islam, 20 years in London, doing it weekly at a place called Speaker's Corner. And one of the things that comes up over and over again is the problem concerning Muhammad and the Quran. Those are really the two pillars of Islam. Islam falls if the Quran is not true. Islam falls if Muhammad is not a prophet. And as I said this morning, we fall if the Bible is not true. Christianity falls if Jesus is not God. So on the same token, we're going to be asking these questions concerning Islam. What exactly, or who exactly is Muhammad? And what is the Quran? Where did it come from? So let's go ahead. Now, just so you know, everything that I put up on the screen is on PowerPoint. I'll be following the PowerPoint. That will be available on the church website, so you can pull it down. Any of you can have access to this website. Don't feel you have to write or keep up with me. I go too fast. But let's go ahead and let's see what the Muslims claim. What they claim is, first of all, that Muhammad is the last and the greatest prophet. They would say that all the other prophets that came before, every one of them had problems. Therefore, God finally gave his final revelation to Muhammad. He is the greatest, the seal of all prophets. They would say that the Quran was his revelation, sent down only to him, and is the final and greatest revelation. So every other book that has gone ahead has been corrupted. And so when you look at these two books, they would say this book, though we call it a revelation, has been corrupted. This comes and seals it. It is the final revelation. If there's any contradiction between these two books, this one always is the one that abrogates the other. And that's found in two references in the Quran, in Surah Ayah 106 and Surah 16, Ayah 101. That which we give, mansuk, we give something better, nasik. Nasik abrogates the mansuk. So if there's any contradiction, this is mansuk, this is nasik. This is what destroys, according to Islam, anything that disagrees with the Quran. Therefore, Islam is the final religion based on Muhammad's life and sayings, which is known as the Sunnah. Everything he did, everything he said is the Sunnah. He is the example for all peoples, in all places, in all times. And the Quran, his teachings. Now, conclusion, Islam is therefore completely dependent on both Muhammad and the Quran. So let's go ahead and investigate both Muhammad and the Quran and see if indeed the Muslims are correct. This is what Muslims have told us, and this is what I'm going to do now is just look at the classical account. What do Muslims say concerning Muhammad? First and foremost, they say that he was born in 570, that he then got a revelation from an angel in Jibril while he was in the Hira cave just north of Mecca. Jibril comes to him while he's meditating and says, "Akra, recite." And his response was, "Ma akra, I cannot recite." He was squeezed, and then the angel repeats the same order. That happened 3 times. Finally, the angel lets him go. He goes back to Mecca, tells the story to his wife Khadija. She then gives a test to him, and he passed that test, and then she goes and tells Waraka ibn Nawfal, her cousin, what had happened. And Waraka ibn Nawfal, then the cousin of Khadija, who was a Christian, stipulates that truly he is a prophet. So it's one of the ironies of history that the person that actually gave the pronouncement as Muhammad is a prophet was a Christian. This is according to their account. In 610 then, those revelations started coming, and if you look at the Quran and you just basically put it in half. Now this Quran, because it's in Arabic, it starts from the right and goes to the left. So for if you just split it in half, the first part of the Quran, or what we know as Medina, the second would be Mecca, the name of the 2 cities where he lived. So this would be Meccan, though it's the latter half of the Quran. This would be Medinan, though it's the first half. Confusing, isn't it? Just turn it upside down and you get the right sequence. But it basically says that this part, the latter part, was revealed between 610 and 622, the first 12 years. In 621, he was woken up in the middle of the night, told to get on the back of the winged horse called Burak there in Mecca, and he flies up to Jerusalem, where in Jerusalem, on the rock, where the Dome of the Rock is built, he then ascends the 7 heavens, meets Allah. Allah tells him to pray 50 times a day. He says, okay. He comes down 2 heavens to the 5th heaven. He meets Moses. Moses says, how many times did he tell you to pray? And he said, well, I was told to pray 50 times. He says, no, go back up and see if you can get it down. So he goes back up to the 7th heaven, gets it to 45, comes back to Moses. No, still too many. So he goes back and forth, bouncing between Allah and Moses, and brings it down from 45 to 40 to 35 to 30, down to 15, down to 10, finally to 5 prayers. Once he gets it to 5 prayers, then Moses, okay, that's enough. So it's Moses that actually stipulates how many prayers Muslims are to pray a day. Comes back down then to Jerusalem, gets back on the Burak, the wing horse, and flies back to Mecca. That's called the Miraj. That happens in 621. In 622 then, he then moves from Mecca up to Medina. That's called the Hijrah, the Exodus, with about 80, some say as many as 200 followers. And that is because of the problems he's having in Mecca. And then from 622 to 632, the last 10 years of his life, he receives the Medinan material, which is all the first part of the Quran. This material here. Now, there are some Meccan references in Medinan, and there's also some Medinan in the Meccan. But rule of thumb, that's Meccan, that's Medinan. Then from 630, he then goes into Mecca, and he takes over Mecca. He then controls all that central part of Arabia, called the Hijaz, and he dies in 632. Suddenly, some believe he was poisoned. From 632 to 634, Abu Bakr then takes over, rules for 2 years. He dies peacefully. From 634 to 644, Umar then takes over, and he is one of the ones that moves out and starts confronting and basically conquering many of the great cities of the Levant. He conquers Basra, he conquers Baghdad, he conquers Damascus, he conquers Jerusalem, and he conquers Cairo. So the 5 great cities of the Levant are now under Arab control. You notice I'm saying Arab control, not Muslim. You'll see why. That happens under the time of Umar. So by 642, the 5 great cities of Levant are now under Arab control. 644 to 656, Uthman then takes over. And Uthman, the 3rd caliph, is important because it is he that actually compiles the Quran. It is he that's given that responsibility. He realizes that there were a number of different variations on the Quran. So he tells Zayd ibn Thabit, who is the secretary of Muhammad, to then rewrite the Quran and to correct it if it needs be. If there's any difficulty, then to use the Qurayshi dialect. And he's given 3 other men to help him, Zubair, Alas, and Harith. And the 4 of them rewrite the Quran and create what we know as the canon of the Quran. That's when the Quran was finally written down, 650, 18 years after Muhammad. The Quran had not been written down when Muhammad died. It was finally written down at the time of Uthman. Very important, 650. Keep that date in your head. 650, mid-7th century. He is then killed, and then Ali comes to power and rules only for 5 years. Ali is the adopted son of Muhammad. Really, for as far as the Shiites are concerned, the real only legitimate heir to Muhammad. Now that's known, that period, from 622 or 624 up until 661, that roughly 40-year period is known as the Rashidun period. That is the rightly guided caliph period. That is the beginning of Islam. That's the golden period of Islam. That's the classical account. Now, I'm just giving you bare bones, just a skeleton view. There could be many other things I could have added to the story, but that's what Muslims have been telling us for 1,400 years. Ooh, wait a minute. Not 1,400 years. I correct myself. 1,200 years. Why do I say that? Has anybody heard any other account? That's really what you've been taught, is it not? That's what you're taught in your schools. That's what all the Muslims are taught. And in every school around the world, this is the classical account. And there's been no reason not to doubt it, because there's no reason for us to assume that anything else has happened, or it could be any different. However, take a look and see, where is it we get that account from? Most of you probably don't know that everything we know about Muhammad himself, his life, is written down in what we call the Siratu Rasulullah, the biography, the life of the Prophet of God. The first man to write it down is Ibn Ishaq. And you can see up there on the, let me just get this thing working. I hope I can get it working so I don't blind myself. Here we go. That's Ibn Ishaq right there. Look at his date, 765. 765. The first biography we have of the Prophet is not written down till 765. He dies in 632. Can you see a problem? The first sayings we have for the Prophet, the sayings are the hadith. These are enormous amount of material. 600,000 hadith were given to a man named Al-Bukhari. Al-Bukhari. dies right here. I'm sorry, let's get this right. See al-Bukhari right here. 870. The first hadith are written down by him. Oh, let me back up. Hold on a minute. Did I say Ibn Ishaq is the first one to write down his biography? That's true, but we don't have any of Ibn Ishaq's material. We're dependent on this man right here, Ibn Hisham, 833. He was a student of Ibn Ishaq. He then takes what Ibn Ishaq has given him, and he throws out what he doesn't like and only retains what he likes. So the only thing we know about Muhammad comes from Ibn Hisham. His date is 833. Muhammad died in 632. Can you see the problem? The first sayings, these 600,000 akhbars that are given to al-Bukhari, he is then to whittle away that which he doesn't like. He takes it from 600,000 and retains only 7,397. So he throws out 98% of it, only retains 2% of it, and that 2% are the 9 volumes we have of al-Bukhari. You can go up online and read them. But that is done in 870. That's 240 years later. Then if you want to talk about the tafsir, to understand this book, you need commentaries. And the commentaries are first written down by Al-Tabari. And Al-Tabari is right there, 923. The first tafsir we have, written by Al-Tabari. Now, many other tafsirs that come after that, you have Baidawi, Zamakhshari, Suyuti, and many others. But the first one is Al-Tabari, 923, 10th century. So, put this in perspective. Everything we know about Muhammad, all his life, everything that happened, how Islam began over here, doesn't get written down till over here, 200 to 300 years later. Does that bother any of you? That should bother all of you. 200 years of what? Why did it take 200 years to write down his story? Why did it take over 200 years, 240 years to write down his sayings? And where did they get it from? Who are these people? Did they ever know Muhammad? Not one of them knew Muhammad. Al-Bukhari from Bukharistan. Bukharistan is in present-day Iraq. Al-Tabari from Tabaristan. That's in present-day Iran. These were people that lived hundreds of miles away and hundreds of years later. So what were they dependent on? Well, they were dependent on what we know as oral tradition. Now, let's look at Jesus. Jesus, we know, has a biography written, in fact, not just one biography, we know of 4 biographies written about Jesus' life, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We know that 3 of them were written within 40 to 50 years of his life. We know that one, John, wrote much later, about 60 years, but we know that John was an eyewitness to everything he wrote, was he not? Matthew was also an eyewitness to everything he wrote. And Mark and Luke got it from the eyewitnesses. So you have 4 testimonies, 4 biographies of Jesus Christ, written either by those who were with Jesus or those who got it from those with Jesus. We know that all the New Testament was written by the first century. Can you see the difference? We're dependent on 30 to 40 years of oral tradition based on the very eyewitness example of the people that actually wrote it. Islam is dependent on 200 to 300 years of oral tradition. Can you see the problem? As a comparison, if we were to impose on the person of Jesus Christ what Islam is now finding out about their prophet, we would have nothing about Jesus written from within Christian sources until the 3rd century. Can you imagine us getting up here? Can you imagine Jack being able to speak and talk about Jesus authoritatively if everything he was dependent on only began to appear in the 3rd century? We wouldn't know who Jesus was. And why would we trust it? Yet this is something Muslims have not acknowledged. So the Western world, especially the secular scholars, are now asking 2 things. And they're coming up to 2 suppositions. Islam, as we know it, they say, did not exist in the 7th century, but evolved over a period of 200 to 300 years. And the Quran probably was not revealed to one man in 22 years, but likely evolved over a period of 50 to 100 years. Their conclusion? The history of Islam, at least from the time of the Caliph Abdul Malik, he ruled from 685 to 705, and before is a later fabrication. Now that's a huge amount to say. But we're going to prove that now tonight. We're going to show you why that's so damaging and what we're now finding. Their concern is this. If so much of the history of early Islam was written down so late, then why did it take so long to write it all down? Were these people not literate? Yes, they were. Remember, By 642, they had taken over Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo. Could people not read and write in Damascus, Jerusalem, Cairo, Basra, Baghdad? Were these not great metropolises? Did they not have a library in Alexandria that was destroyed by fire in the 5th century? Certainly these people could read and write. But more than that, they started moving right across North Africa. By 661, they had taken much of North Africa. They started moving the other direction towards India. And by the end of the 7th century, by the time that Abdul Malik comes to power, they controlled all the way from Spain in the west to India in the east. Are you suggesting no one could read and write in any of those countries? And the Muslims themselves tell us that they can read and write. Because where in the world did this book come from? It's a book. It has words, letters written down. According to Islamic tradition, it was written down by Zayd ibn Thabit. Who was Zayd ibn Thabit? He was a secretary of Muhammad. How can you be a secretary if you can't read and write?